Dear friends, you're welcome to this other episode of the Beyond Africa podcast. On Beyond Africa, we discuss African issues and we look at Africans in the diaspora, Africans back at home, and African friends, how we can put ourselves together to transform the continent of Africa. It is our pleasure to always welcome you here, to hear your insights, and to see you actively participate in the conversation. So this is 2024. And in November 2024, the Americans are going to be electing the 47th president of the United States. A decision that could have far-reaching consequences on the world and Africa in particular. Meanwhile, as Americans are going to the polls to elect the new president, the anti-Western sentiment in Africa is growing and the United States is not left out. So, what can the Americans do to counter this anti-Western sentiment on the continent? In this episode of Beyond Africa, we explore how the outcome of the upcoming elections can either aggravate or mitigate the African anti-Western and anti-American sentiment which is growing on the continent. What can the African diaspora in the United States do to influence the 47th American president and his foreign policy, to ensure that America is not left apart, to ensure that the American foreign policy gains good ground on the continent of Africa? Otherwise, what should African Americans look for in the foreign policies advanced by the two candidates? The two leading candidates in these elections are Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Of course, it is a tale of a déjà vu. They have been there for 4 years each. What should Africans be looking for? When I come back, I'll introduce my guest to you. You're welcome to the program, Ambassador Tibor Nagy.
Thanks very, very much for having me. Sounds like some fascinating topics today, Bernard.
It's always fascinating when we have you around. You know, we know that you are dedicated to the continent of Africa. You've done a lot of work on Africa, and you still focus and concentrate on what is happening on the continent. And of course, we cannot skip an important moment like this without hearing your voice. We know that there is a growing anti-American, anti-Western sentiment on the continent. And at the same time, elections are coming up. Is it an opportunity to see how we could resolve this, how we could mitigate the anti-Western influence or sentiments on the African continent? And who else can tell us more about this? Who else knows Africa? And who else masters American foreign policy to the extent that he can advise Africans, especially the African diaspora that will be voting at the next American elections? Again, you're welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. I don't know who you're talking about, but it sounds like a very impressive person.
Okay. Let me tell you the person I'm talking about. The person I'm talking about is the former United States Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. And before assuming that position, this person I'm talking about had served as a United States representative or ambassador in different categories in Africa, in Ethiopia, in Nigeria, in Zambia, and in Cameroon. So maybe that person identifies himself at this particular moment.
Hey, Bernard, those are some really, really intriguing issues that you raised, and I think it's very important to talk about it. There's not going to be an easy solution, or, you know, when I say it's a solution, I'm obviously looking at it from the point of view of the West. And also I have to underline, I do not speak on behalf of the U.S. government because I am fully retired right now. So these are my personal opinions. As you said, there has been a very, very sharp anti-Western turn in Africa. The reasons for that are obviously historical, going back decades to colonialism, but they're also, unfortunately, more recent because all of a sudden we're in a period of time when Africa has a choice, as to who they're going to be dealing with. It's no longer you deal with Europe or America or Japan or, maybe South Korea, but the Africans have a whole spectrum of international partners that they can deal with, so they can pick and choose. And it's a period of time where no one can take Africa for granted. Unfortunately, this is also mixed up with what I consider some real policy failures on the part of Western countries, including the United States, because with Africa now becoming younger and younger every year, and the young people are technologically sophisticated. They don't just listen to the radio or look at the newspaper. They can go online and see all types of information. And they see that some of the Western attitudes towards Africa have been extremely, extremely hypocritical. And I've spoken about this before, and I've written about it, that U.S. foreign policy, unfortunately, is tinged with quite a bit of hypocrisy, that we seem to hold sub-Saharan African countries to a higher standard than we do many other countries. You know, in Africa, we will talk about, a coup d'etat that cannot stand, whereas take a country like Egypt, when General Sisi becomes President Sisi, and the United States doesn't even call it a coup d'etat. So there's a tinge of hypocrisy that Africa's young people especially see through. So I really think it's very important, if the United States wants to turn away from this anti-Western sentiment in Africa, then we're going to definitely have to change how we treat with African countries.
Thank you very much for giving this broad introduction that touches on basically the critical points we're going to be talking about. And you highlight very critical issues that we're going to touch on them. We're going to pick on them one after the other. Now, it's election time in America, and you paint it as a situation that does not have an easy solution. But we all know it is grounded on foreign policy, historical foreign policy, colonialism, and all whatnot. But then at this material point in time, how important is the African diaspora to American politics? Do American politicians actually see the African diaspora as a critical constituency that can shape the American foreign policy towards Africa?
I don't think that as of yet all of the American politicians have recognized the critical importance that the African diaspora can play in U.S. elections. I'll give you an example. I have heard from a number of my Ethiopian friends that the Ethiopian diaspora is taking credit for the election of Governor Youngkin, Republican, in Virginia over a very, very close election, because the Ethiopian diaspora was unhappy at the time with the foreign policy towards Ethiopia of the Biden administration. So the critical importance, Bernard, is the diaspora united or is it split? And if it's split up, obviously then it's the sides will cancel each other out. But if there's an issue on which the diaspora is united, and if there is an impact in a local election, say, for example, Somali Americans in Minnesota, or Ethiopian Americans, say in Texas or in the Washington, D.C. area, and if they're united on a specific issue, then American politicians will start paying more and more attention to them. But it's critically important to make your voice heard. And if you don't make your voice heard, then you will be ignored.
Thank you so much for that clarification. But now going into the elections, and we cannot expect to have a homogeneous African diaspora. And we cannot equally expect to have a homogeneous American political class. They've separated. Even when you go to the Republican Party, it is still broken. You go into the Democrat Party, it is still broken. And they have different lines they follow. Without focusing on the unity or the unanimity of the African diaspora, what can the African diaspora actually do at this point to shape the American foreign policy? I know it's not an easy job, but without trying to be unanimous, how can they influence American foreign policy towards Africa?
I think there is one point on which there would be unanimity amongst every single diaspora group, and that is to say, pay attention to Africa. Because, let's be honest, as far as I can see, I mean, we'll watch the debate this Thursday night between President Biden and former President Trump. I will bet you that Africa is not even going to be mentioned in that debate. And I will bet you, having served as Africa policy advisor on several presidential campaigns, I will bet you that Africa will play an extremely minimal role in the upcoming presidential campaign, unless there's some major, event, usually a disaster that might happen. If something horrendous happens in Sudan or someplace else, at that point it may be a blip in the campaign. But most of the time, Africa it's going to be a non-issue as far as the campaign goes. And to change that, it is critically important for the African diaspora to make its voice heard. And it's not just the African diaspora, but it's the African American community. Also, you look at these other national communities, the Italians, the Irish, and others, they make their countries a point of priority in American politics. Can you imagine that if the African American community, which I forget if it's 12% or whatever percent of the American electorate, if they had a unified voice to say, okay, Mr. President, members of Congress, we want you to give priority to African issues. We want you to give priority to Africa. We want you to talk about African development. We want you to focus on African crises. Then the American political system would. But right now, there's Bernard. There's one good news about Africa. Okay, one good news. Africa in Washington remains as one of the very, very few bilateral issues. The people who care about Africa, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, they get along with each other. Like, I'm going to be on a panel on Thursday for the Carnegie, endowment, and there's going to be 4 former assistant secretaries of state, 2 Democrats, 2 from Republican administrations, and we all know each other. We all get along. We all want the same thing. So, from the people who deal with Africa, it's not a matter of Republican or Democrat, because we all want to see Africa succeed. But to be able to have any political capital or any kind of influence in Washington, you have to have voters. And we see, one thing we do see in this election is that both President Biden, the Democrats always depend on the African American vote, but President Trump is making real outreach to Black voters. He was recently at a Black church, I think, in Detroit, because President Trump knows that his road to the White House, if he gets a larger share of African Americans than traditionally vote for Republican, it's going to be a very, very close election. That could swing the election too. So this is an ideal moment when African Americans could step forward and say, we care about a lot of domestic issues, but foreign policy, we care about Africa. That is where, we originate from. That's where we came from originally. We want the American government to focus on Africa.
Thank you. I was going to ask if there is a need to differentiate between domestic issues in the United States elections and foreign policy issues in United States elections, and I think you've just touched on that. But one other thing I wanted to highlight is the fact you mentioned that you've served on as the Africa policy advisor on different campaigns. When I was introducing you as the former assistant secretary for Africa, I was going to ask you, do you think you're coming back?
Who knows? That's always up to the president. The president makes those kind of appointments. So who knows? You know in my heart how much I care about Africa. So I'm always, open to serving in Africa. But again, that's totally up to, whoever is going to be in the White House.
I like the optimistic smile you started with. So let's hope that it happens when the elections are done. So